Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar about safeguarding for parent-carer forums that's been provided through Contact Family Strengthening Parent-Carer Participation Programme. So the webinar today is hosted by myself, Sue North. Some of you may know me. Previously I was the Director for the Parent Participation Programme at Contact Family, and I work now as an independent consultant and trainer. If there's a technical glitch, please bear with us. We do have Helen Reid here managing the IT side of the webinar. So we hope that there will be no glitches and that you'll all be able to enjoy the webinar as we go. As there are so many people on the webinar today, it's not practical for verbal questions to be taken. So that does mean that you all will be muted throughout. But if you do have any questions, you can submit them to Helen, who then let me have those. You do that by clicking on the question icon on the toolbar, as you can see, and that allows you to type your question in the text box and submit it. We'll answer as many questions as we've got time for. If there isn't time for all of the questions, we will answer them and put them on the website for you at a later stage. So don't be put off from submitting your questions if you've got any. So this is Safeguarding for Parent-Carer Forums. As I say, some of you may know me from my work with parent-carer forums and participation over the last 5 years, but prior to that I worked as I am a social worker, and I began my career working in child protection and safeguarding, and then was a team manager and a head of service in the local authority working with safeguarding child protection teams. So that's why I'm presenting for you today. So the aims of our webinar today are the following. So to support and ensure forum leaders understand the issues around safeguarding children and young people, and we're going to touch on vulnerable adults. To support you to think about what policies and procedures you might need for the safe running of your forum, to know how to apply the policies and procedures, and to know for forums where you can seek advice and support about safeguarding issues if you need to. And we're going to cover all of these things hopefully within the session. We're going to look at what we mean by safeguarding, the legislation that underpins it, definitions and types of abuse, the role of forums, some key components of things to think about for your policy and procedures, about building your confidence in recognising and managing safeguarding concerns, having a look at safeguarding and confidentiality and where there are difficulties in relation to that, kind of what you should do, handling safeguarding concerns about committee members, staff and volunteers, thinking about service provision and safeguarding concerns in relation to service provision, DBS checks, regulated activity, and where to report concerns, further training and information. So we have got a huge amount to get through today, so I will be talking quite fast, and obviously for some of this it's just a brief overview rather than any detail because of the time limits that we have today. So, forums are often not responsible for the care of support children and vulnerable adults as part of your core business and what you do. You know that for forums it's about enabling parent carers to have a voice and participate in service decisions. So I know that we've certainly had discussions in forums and within the network about, well, why do we need safeguarding policies then? We don't look after children, we never see children if parents aren't there. But what we know is that forums are a place where families come, where families meet and benefit from that joint support, where you certainly will probably be meeting with some vulnerable adults. And actually, we all have a responsibility about ensuring the safety and well-being of those we come into contact with, whether you're a forum or a voluntary group or a statutory organisation. And we also have a responsibility for our reps or volunteers or steering group members who come into contact with those children, young people and vulnerable adults in terms of making sure, as far as we can, that things are safe for everybody. So it is really important to make sure that we understand that it is important for us all to consider safeguarding. I just want to say as well, before we start looking in more detail at some of these things, that I know safeguarding is a very emotive subject and touches lots of people, either individually, personally, or maybe in terms of your own children or people you know. And because this isn't an interactive session where we can talk and I can't see you, obviously I can't pick those things up. So just look after yourself as we go through this. If you find it upsetting or distressing, you might, feel free to leave the webinar. The slides will be available afterwards. So yeah, just look after yourself as we go through this. So what do we actually mean by safeguarding? Because it is a term that's used quite a lot. And I think for some people there's a bit of a confusion between what's safeguarding, what is child protection, what does it mean? So safeguarding is a term that incorporates child protection, but it's much more inclusive, and it looks at much wider issues about prevention of risk to children and ways in which we can ensure and promote the well-being of children and young people. And early help is an important part of safeguarding, but it is much broader than I think what we traditionally think of when we think of child protection. And for forums, that's really important because it's thinking about how do we make sure that the events we run, the activities we run, how do we make sure they are safe, both physically in terms of the risk assessments we may need, how do we make sure children are going to be looked after and cared for safely, as well as thinking about how do we safeguard and protect children from risk of abuse or exploitation. And safeguarding, the term safeguarding kind of became more widely used after the inquiry into the death of Victoria Colombier, and there were some significant reports from Lord Lamming where he talked about the fact that often local areas, voluntary organisations, statutory providers looked at child protection in quite a narrow way, and for Victoria Colombier that there had been a lot of contact with a lot of agencies where if they had perhaps taken a bit of a broader view about her safety and well-being in other ways, that there might have been steps that could have been taken to protect her. So he strongly advocated the fact that we needed to think much more broadly around safeguarding and how we can promote the welfare of children as well as protect them from harm. And so everybody, as I said before, who comes into children has a role to play, and these are the reasons why. And you may be familiar with some of these photographs, and these are all children or young people who have died as the result of abuse or neglect. We hear all the time about those high-profile serious case reviews where children have been seriously hurt or have died. What we know is that there is a reduction over the last 5 years in the number of children who have died from abuse and neglect, but it's still one child dying from abuse and neglect is too much, and that's why we all have a role to play. But child protection is a more specific description, and what that means is it's part of safeguarding and promoting welfare, but it does refer to activity that's undertaken to protect specific children and young people who have experienced or are likely to experience significant harm. So that's what we mean in the distinction between safeguarding and child protection. So safeguarding and promoting the welfare of children includes all of these things. Okay, so we're going to move on now to legislation, statutory and non-statutory guidance that underpins both work, safeguarding and child protection work with children and young people, and with vulnerable adults. So for children and young people, the main pieces of legislation that we talk about are the Children Act 1989, that was supplemented in 2004 by another Children Act, and they are really the most significant pieces of legislation that provide the detail and the statute around how local authorities are required and work with families where there is cause for concern and where we believe a child is at risk or has suffered harm. The Human Rights Act also underpins some of that work. Working together to safeguard children is statutory guidance, and working together to safeguard children has been a document that's been used for many, many years, but it is updated, and the most recent update was 2015. You can access all of these documents free online. You can download them. Working together to safeguard children is as statutory guidance, explains how you put the law into practice. So it's probably a helpful document to at least have downloaded and have available to you should you ever need it. There's also some practice guidance, so it's non-statutory guidance around safeguarding disabled children, because there are some specific vulnerabilities that we know disabled children face that mean that we sometimes have to have some additional safeguards in place to make sure that we're affording disabled children the same level of protection as non-disabled children. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more going on. And then also the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. For vulnerable adults, there's different legislation and guidance. So we've got the Care Act 2014 and the Care and Support Statutory Guidance 2014. And actually the Care Act was really quite significant in terms of bringing in some clear statutory guidance around how support is provided for vulnerable adults. The Mental Capacity Act is really important for vulnerable adults because there are particular elements about understanding if people have capacity to make decisions where they may be placing themselves at risk. The Mental Capacity Act Code of Practice is also significant, and of course again the Human Rights Act. And No Secrets is an older document but still useful. Okay, so we're going to move on now to look at some definitions and types of abuse and what we mean by what. So these definitions all come from the Working Together to Safeguard Children document for children and young people and from the Care Act for vulnerable adults. So abuse and neglect generally is a form of maltreatment of a child. When we say child, we mean children and young people. And somebody can abuse and neglect a child by inflicting harm or by failing to act to prevent harm. And that's really important because we know that there are lots of families where perhaps there is no intent to harm or abuse their child, but by failing to do things that make sure children are looked after and safe and well, those children may be harmed anyway. So children can be abused in a family or in an institutional community setting, or more rarely by others, not people known to them. But we have seen a real significant increase in the number of sexual exploitation and online abuse of children and young people. So they may be abused by an adult or adults, or by another child or children. So physical abuse. Physical abuse is, one of obviously the most obvious forms of abuse because often it leaves marks that are visible. So it's a form of abuse which can involve hitting, shaking, throwing, poisoning, burning or scalding, drowning, suffocating, or otherwise causing physical harm to a child. And physical harm can also be caused when a parent or carer fabricates or deliberately induces illness in a child. And some of you may be familiar with that. It used to be termed as Munchausen's by proxy, and lots of areas call it factitious illness in a child now, where there are concerns that perhaps a parent or a carer is deliberately fabricating symptoms, and sometimes children can well, certainly be significantly harmed and on occasion die. Okay. So emotional abuse. Emotional abuse is the persistent emotional maltreatment of a child, such as to cause severe and persistent adverse effects on the child's emotional development. It can involve conveying to children they're worthless and loved, inadequate, or valued only in as far as they meet the needs of another person. Emotional abuse is a really difficult kind of form of abuse to evidence and detect, and it's hard as well because sometimes it's based on a judgment value about what we think is acceptable and appropriate, and what other people think is acceptable and appropriate. But within that scale of different value bases of what is or isn't appropriate, we know that for some children they experience very significant emotional abuse, where certainly their emotional needs are not met, and it can go beyond that and be really very damaging. It can involve serious bullying, including cyberbullying, and we are going to look at bullying a little bit later on, and can cause children to feel frightened, in danger, and it can also include exploitation and corruption of children. And And what we'd have to say is, however a child may be abused or harmed, there's usually always some form of emotional abuse attached to that, even though it can also occur on its own. So a child may not be being physically abused or sexually abused, but may just be being emotionally abused in the way that they're treated. And we sometimes see perhaps where siblings are treated very differently emotionally, and we know that that can be so damaging for people. So these are some of the things that often you'll see where children and people are being emotionally abused: persistent ridicule, rejection and humiliation, living in an atmosphere of fear and intimidation, not being allowed to have contact with other children, having really inappropriate expectations imposed upon them, and living in those families where there's kind of really low warmth and high criticism, being bullied and scapegoated. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit now about sexual abuse of children. And here's the definition of what we mean by sexual abuse. It involves forcing or enticing a child or young person to take part in sexual activities, whether or not the child is aware of what is happening, whether or not the child consents to what is happening. Oh, sorry, I think we've lost the slide there. And that can involve non-contact activities, so things such as involving children in looking at or producing sexual images or photographs, watching other people engage in sexual activities, or encouraging children to behave in sexually inappropriate ways, or grooming a child in preparation for abuse, which is a relatively new piece of legislation that's been enacted. What we know is that there has been a huge increase in the online sexual abuse and child sexual exploitation of children, and the NSPCC last week published their most recent report into the data around safeguarding disabled children in a report called How Safe Are Our Children? Again, you can download that for free off the NSPCC website, and it's really quite shocking when you look at the significant increase there has been in relation to these forms of sexual abuse of children and young people. Now, some of that may be because there are better reporting processes in place and because people are more vigilant and aware of these things, but it does highlight the fact that a significantly large number of children and young people are at risk or are being abused in this way. So online sexual abuse, we talked about very briefly, includes the use of technology to manipulate, exploit, coerce or intimidate a child to engage in the activities that we talked about before, and in grooming a child we talked about before. Child sexual exploitation, and we saw some really high profile cases in Rotherham and Telford and Peterborough, is a form of sexual abuse that involves the manipulation and or coercion of young people under the age of 18 into sexual activity in exchange for things such as money, gifts, accommodation, affection or status. And what we see a lot in child sexual exploitation is that often young people are really enticed into what they believe is a loving relationship that very quickly becomes an exploitative and very threatening and aggressive experience for them. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about neglect. So neglect is the persistent failure to meet a child's basic physical and or psychological needs, likely to result in the serious impairment of a child's health or development. And neglect can occur during pregnancy and as a result of maternal substance misuse. Sometimes babies are born with significant difficulties, and it can also involve a parent or carer failing to provide adequate food or shelter or clothing, failing to protect a child from physical harm or danger. They fail to ensure access to appropriate medical care or treatment, and it can also include the neglect of or unresponsiveness to a child's basic emotional needs. And neglect is very difficult because, again, some elements of how we consider this are based on our own personal value judgments about what we think is important for children and young people. Certainly, having worked as a social worker, I work with lots of families where there was no doubt that the parents loved their children very much, but they were unable or unwilling to provide even the most basic of care in terms of ensuring that their children had food, had appropriate shelter, had appropriate clothing, went to school, were taken to the doctors when they needed it. And I think we kind of went from a time where we believed that as long as children were loved, it didn't really matter if those needs weren't met, to understanding the huge impact it can have for the future lives of children and young people when those basic needs are neglected for them. So it's a serious concern. Okay, so we've already talked about that a little bit. So then these are some of the other things that where I guess what we've seen, particularly over recent years, an increase So domestic violence is a criminal offence arising out of physical, sexual, psychological, emotional, financial abuse by one person against a current or former partner in a close relationship, or against a current or former family member. And again, I think at one point, there was kind of a view of, well, if children weren't harmed or involved in altercations, it wouldn't really affect them, to a much better understanding of the huge emotional impact on children of living in a home where there is domestic violence, and the real impact and challenges they will have in their lives if steps aren't taken to try to resolve and support that situation. And then bullying, and we know bullying is a really significant fact in children and young people's lives. Often when we ask children for them what are the most important things in terms of how they are safeguarded, bullying is always up there on the top of the list. And so we're talking about repetitive, intentional hurting of one person or group by another person or group, and where the relationship involves an imbalance of power. It could be physical, verbal, psychological. It can happen face-to-face or through cyberspace. And I think, that's an area where we've seen huge increases in terms of that online harassment and bullying. We know that there's significantly higher numbers of disabled children that experience that. So we know, again, that can have a huge emotional impact on children and young people. So that's a quick run through about the definitions of abuse in terms of what we talk about for children and young people. There's much more detail in Working Together and in the How Safe Are Our Children document if you want to find out a little bit more. So when we talk about vulnerable adults, we're talking about adults who are aged over 18 years, who are in receipt of or may be in need of community care services because of a mental health or other disability, age or illness, and who may be unable to take care of him or herself and protect themselves against significant harm or exploitation. An adult safeguarding means the protection of a person's rights to live safely, free from abuse and neglect. And as I said earlier, the Care Act brought in some significant statutory requirements. In children's services, there have been local children's safeguarding boards since, again, the Climbier inquiry, but even before that, there were area child protection committees which had a different but similar kind of multi-agency role and responsibility for ensuring that there were good safeguarding practices in place in a local area. And that wasn't a statutory requirement in relation to vulnerable adults until the Care Act implemented that. There were some areas that had safeguarding adult boards and had chosen to do that themselves. It was certainly a recommendation of good practice, but it wasn't a requirement, which it now is, so that's positive. So there are some different definitions and some same definitions of abuse and neglect for vulnerable adults. So we've got the same ones that we looked at for children: physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect. But then there are some different definitions as well that obviously pertain to the fact that, as an adult, there are different risks and vulnerabilities. So the definitions include psychological abuse, exploitation, financial or material abuse, which again we know is something that many vulnerable adults experience, discriminatory abuse and institutional abuse. And of course, we don't want to forget disability hate crime, and we have here a photograph of Francesca, who was very sadly subject to significant disability hate crime, both as a child, a young person, and as a vulnerable adult. And very sadly, her mother chose to end both her and Francesca's life in an effort to protect her from that, because no steps were taken by those that knew about it, where steps could have been taken to try to end that for her. So disability hate crime, again, is very significant in terms of thinking about how vulnerable adults are supported. So what we know is that nearly 1 in 5 young people aged 11 to 17 have experienced high levels of abuse and neglect. Nearly 1 in 20 young people, and in fact actually I think that number's probably risen, have experienced contact sexual abuse. I think I said earlier there's a decrease in children and young people subject to physical abuse, significant rise in those experiencing sexual abuse. And there are currently 62,210 children identified as needing protection from abuse in the UK. But the NSPCC estimate that for each one of those children that there are another 8 who are unidentified who are suffering abuse. So we're talking about some significant risks for our children and young people, and that's why safeguarding is everybody's business, because we all need to do what we can do to minimise those risks or make sure that children and young people are afforded appropriate safeguarding and child protection processes if they are abused or harmed. So I'm going to just talk quickly around issues for disabled children and young people. And we know research demonstrates to us that disabled children are 3 to 4 times more likely to be abused than non-disabled children. And there are a huge range of contributing factors that increase the vulnerability of disabled children and young people. And we certainly, unfortunately, don't have time to talk about those today. And I'm sure as parent carers, you will be aware of some of those. The reason, however, that I wanted to include this slide is because as a forum, obviously you are working with and linking with families of disabled children and children with SEN, and because we know that there are heightened risks and vulnerabilities, it makes it even more important to make sure that as forums we have appropriate policies and procedures in place should you ever need to use them. Okay, just going to take a little sip of water. So, we're going to have a little look now about the key components of safeguarding policies and procedures. And, you know, I appreciate as forums that you're asked to do so many things, and there are requirements to do so many things, that the thought of another policy or procedure may just be the last thing you want to think about. But I am here to really advocate strongly that it is really good practice, and I think essential really for any forum or group that is working in the community to have a robust safeguarding policy and procedure. And we're going to talk through the difference between the policy and procedures, kind of some of the key things that you might want to think about adding in there. What I'd say is don't reinvent the wheel. Lots of forums already have policies and procedures in place, so there's plenty to look at and share from. There's lots of examples on the internet, and there'll be some examples on the CAF website of policies and procedures. You know, so have a look at those, pick the bits that are relevant to you, add the things that you think might be missing for your forum, but please do make sure you've got a policy and procedure in relation to safeguarding. So, your policy really should be quite brief. You should say not more than a couple of pages long, because your policy is about laying out your forum's commitment to safeguarding children, young people and vulnerable adults. So it's just making it clear what your position is, why you think it's important, and it's important in terms of having a policy so that you can share that with your forum members, with children and young people that you might be coming into contact with. If you have volunteers or staff members in your forum, that they're very clear about it, but also for the others that you work with, because I think for forums, you know, we know that sometimes for forums it's about your credibility working with partners, and having a safeguarding policy helps to demonstrate your credibility as a group in an organisation, that you understand these risks that there are, and that as a forum and a group you're committed to doing what you can to keep children, young people and vulnerable adults safe. So probably I would suggest that you have a separate safeguarding policy for children and young people and a separate one for vulnerable adults. If you can't do that, or you just think it's too much, you know, put them together. They were just different elements for the two different cohorts, really, which is why I suggest having different ones. The legislation is different, as we've looked at, and some of your contact will be different. So that's my recommendation to you. So your policy, these are some of the things that you might want to think about including in your policy. So obviously identifying your forum, its purpose and its function, what you do, what you want to say about keeping children, young people and vulnerable adults safe, so just reaffirming your commitment to doing that, recognising the needs of particularly vulnerable groups, and we've talked about obviously disabled children who are your key group that you'll be potentially in contact with, but there are other particularly vulnerable groups as well that you might want to think about. Briefly state the legislation and guidance that supports your policy. You might want to add why you're taking these steps, how in broad terms, because your procedure will include the detail about how you're going to meet your responsibility, and that might include information about how you make sure that those who might be working with children, families and vulnerable adults are safe, so that might include information about DBS, who it applies to, how you're going to put the policy into action, so you might want to link that to your procedures. And just remember about trying to make it as clearly written as you can, using words and phrases that will be understood by those who read it, because it's really important that your forum members do understand what your forum's position is about safeguarding, for a couple of reasons really, and we're going to look at those also a bit later on, about that sometimes the conflict there is around confidentiality and safeguarding, where your forum sits in that. If you have a policy that explains that right from the start and that everybody is aware of your position in relation to that, I think that makes it's much more helpful when, or if you're in a position where perhaps you do have to breach somebody's confidence to do something to safeguard a child, a young person or a vulnerable adult. So again, it's about kind of being prepared and setting that scene. It's also really helpful because you may be doing work with your forum members where you might be reviewing services or looking at things that are happening in your local area, and some of the feedback or responses you get might lead you to have a concern about a service, and that would be something that you would have a responsibility really for reporting and making sure that services that perhaps are not as safe as they need to be continue to work. And we know there are lots of challenges around doing that, but it is really important again that if you have been clear in your policy about the fact that anything that leads you to have concern about children and people, vulnerable adults, whether it's about that individual's child or young person, or if it's about the fact that a service will be working with other children and people, then that's again really helpful to have it in a policy there. So when you may have to have those hard discussions with people, you can say, this is our policy, this is what we've all agreed to abide by, this is what we have to do. Okay, so your procedures should explain how you are going to implement your policy. It's another good reason to keep your policy brief, so your procedures don't end up being a huge, great document. And it's always a challenge about making sure you've got the right amount of detail in your procedure to support you should a safeguarding issue arise, a safeguarding or child protection issue arise, without making it so dense that it's hard to read it or understand it. But usually your procedure should be more specific about how you're going to respond to any safeguarding or child protection issue. It should include information about how those who work in the forum or who perhaps are on the steering group will be supported to understand safeguarding, how you will record and report concerns. We would really recommend that it's really helpful to designate someone in your forum to be a safeguarding lead. And it's particularly helpful if that is somebody that has some experience or has had some particular training in relation to that. And it may be that you might want to consider co-opting somebody on your steering group or your committee to assist with this if you really don't feel there's anybody within your existing committee who has that skill set or wants to undertake that role. It's really helpful to have that person because forums are really quite unique as groups in terms of the fact you don't have somebody that, a manager that you can go and report things up to, which is what we would normally recommend in terms of providing training to organisations is, always talk to your management. Well, for forums, often there isn't any management, but if you have a designated safeguarding lead, what it means is that you have somebody that can perhaps take a more objective view and look at the situation with you and help you as you make the decisions about what actions you need to take. And also in your procedure, you can talk about how you ensure the safety of your activities to make sure that you are safeguarding all of your children, young people and vulnerable adults. So guidelines about how you're going to work with families if you've got concerns. I think we've talked already a little bit about how you recruit and select. Again, making sure as best you can that those you do recruit and select are safe people. How you support, supervise and offer training to your parent reps, volunteers and staff. And how everyone in the forum understands the behaviour and conduct that is expected of your committee, volunteer and parent reps. So that may link to your code of conduct that you may already have in your policies as a forum. It's really helpful to link those things because often you will have in your code of conduct about acceptable behaviours and what you think is reasonable to do or not to do. So if somebody steps outside of that, that may be a warning sign to you in terms of their behaviour and their conduct, and it's useful just to make sure there's a crossover there. Also really important is to make sure that there is a whistleblowing element within your procedure. You might want to have a separate whistleblowing policy. You might want to think about how you include that in there, but certainly something that's very clear about what people can do if they have a concern that they've tried to raise through whatever way you agree as a forum is the appropriate way, and that they still feel that hasn't been dealt with appropriately, is what they do and what the expectation is, and how then that person will be treated and or supported through that process. Okay. So we're going to talk now, I'm just checking the time, yeah, I think we're okay, about how to respond to a concern and what forums need to think about in terms of confidentiality. We know that safeguarding is, like I said at the start, it can be really emotive, and thinking about how do you deal with all of this can be really complex, particularly if it's the first time you've ever experienced it and been part of it. So we know that there's all of these anxieties around for forum members if they observe or see or hear something that makes them concerned about a child. And there are several ways that you might suspect that a child is at risk or is being abused, and that might be that something is disclosed to you by a child or a young person. Something might be disclosed to you by the perpetrator, so the person that is causing the harm. There might be a disclosure to you from a third party, so from a friend or a neighbour or somebody not directly related, or it may be by your own observations of something you see that causes you concern as well. So even though there's all those anxieties maybe that are flying around, and there are all those different ways in which things may become apparent to you, what you should do or what you shouldn't do is ignore it. So never ever ignore it. You need to be clear about the limits in relation to confidentiality, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. So don't promise people you won't ever say anything to anybody, and if anybody ever starts a conversation with, I'm telling you this, but you've got to promise me you won't tell anyone, you know, your response really should always be, well, there are certain things that we can't keep confidential, these are what they are. Oh, sorry, we'll just go back up. But there are some things that we can't keep confidential. So remember that people, whether it's children or young people or perpetrators, usually disclose for a reason, and that's because they want something doing about it and they want some help to stop. Even if they may not recognise that immediately, and maybe trying to elicit your silence in relation to that, remember that disclosures are made for a reason. And your initial response to any disclosure that you may receive is really, really important. It's really important for children and young people. It's really important if somebody that's causing the abuse discloses to you. It's very important to be supportive, to listen. Like we said earlier, be clear about your limits in relation to confidentiality. Don't promise things that you can't deliver. And just try and support and listen. Don't ask questions, because it isn't your role to investigate whether or not something has happened. And often, if you do investigate, that might create further difficulties down the way, particularly if there is a significant either risk of abuse or abuse that has happened, which may result in some kind of more formal investigation and possibly even criminal inquiry. If you ask leading questions, if you have asked questions that have been inappropriate, it can have a real impact on all of those things. Speak to your designated safeguarding officer as soon as you can, and always make a record. Sign it and date it as soon as you possibly can after the event or the discussion that you have had. Again, it's really important just to keep a record of that and to keep it somewhere safe, because particularly in terms of referring it on, you want the best notes that you can. Doing it 2 or 3 days later is not helpful. Do it as soon as you can while your memory is as fresh and as clear as it can be. So should we tell parent carers if we feel we need to make a referral? And by making a referral, I'm talking about making a referral to your child protection team, your children's social care team, whatever it is they're called in your local area. And this is really an issue to consider carefully, because we always want within forums to be honest and transparent with families when you can. And as we said earlier, don't make promises you can't keep. But you also have to weigh that against the fact that you don't want to jeopardise an investigation that may happen. And particularly if it's a disclosure around sexual abuse, you have to give that some particular concern, because what we know is that if children have been sexually abused or sexually exploited, and you inform those who may or may not be part of it, then there's the chance that that those children and young people may be intimidated or may be threatened, or evidence may be destroyed. So you really have to consider it on a case-by-case situation, depending on what it is, how it's come to your attention, what you know about it. And what I would say is, if you're not sure, seek advice from your local child protection team, because if you need to make a referral, you can phone them and explain the situation and ask their advice. If they feel you should have told the parent, they will tell you that, and in fact they probably won't take the referral until you do. But if it's right that you haven't done, then they will accept that referral from you. So it's important just to think about that and think about those issues. You obviously don't want to be in a position where the families you work with don't trust you, but again, our priority, our paramount concern is safeguarding children and people. and vulnerable adults. So how do you make a referral? So referrals are usually made to the area in which the child lives, and it's that local authority that will then deal with the issue, will look at whether they feel it merits a child protection investigation or not. It may lead to some early help or early support, and it's them that will then process that as it goes on. There might be occasions where, if the allegations are made in a different locality, it may be that area where the initial referral is made, particularly thinking of children and people that may be living away from home, perhaps in residential schools or in care settings. But usually it will be to the local area where the child lives. So we've already talked about this a couple of times now, but just to kind of reiterate, the requirement for confidentiality and data protection is overridden by the need to ensure that children are kept safe. So obviously forums, again, know the importance of data protection and confidentiality. However, if you have reason to believe the child is at risk or has suffered harm, then you are perfectly within your rights to override that requirement for confidentiality. And we've just talked a bit as well about, it's usually good practice to talk with parents unless doing so would place a child or others at risk of harm and intimidation in terms of referring that information on. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit now about concerns about steering group members, trustees, if you're a charity, volunteers or staff members if your forum is big enough to employ staff members. So, allegations about those who work with children, young people and vulnerable adults are taken really seriously, and the reason for that is because historically we know that often perpetrators of abuse will target groups, areas, jobs where they will have access to children, young people and vulnerable adults, and particularly vulnerable children and young people. What we've also seen historically is that where those people have been in those kind of jobs or roles or positions of trust, that when perhaps an allegation has been made, it wasn't taken seriously, and not only did that mean that perhaps the child or young person that made the allegation wasn't responded to in an appropriate way, but it meant that other children were subsequently harmed as a result of that. So there are much more robust processes and procedures if a safeguarding concern is raised about somebody who works with children, young people, vulnerable adults and cohorts of those groups. And I know you might be thinking, well we're all volunteer, none of us really work as forum members, we're here to participate and represent. And that's true to a degree, but by being a steering group member in your forum, in the eyes of your forum members, you have responsibility, you have credibility, you have some level of perceived or real power within your forum. So it's important to just make sure that there are clear standards that you expect from your staff, volunteers and committee members. And again, it all links back to your code of practice and your policies and procedures. So having those in place can really help to minimise your risk, making sure that you're promoting safer caring practices in everyday things is really useful as well. And it minimises the risk both for children and people and vulnerable adults, but also for your staff and your volunteers and your trustees in terms of protecting them if they're following your procedures and policies and an allegation is made about them or against them. It's useful for you to be able to say, well, look, we always do this, we always make sure of this, and they've adhered to this at all times. So I'm just going to go back again because I think we missed a little bit there. The other thing is, as potential volunteers, staff, committee members, it is just helpful to understand the process when an allegation might be made against a staff member or a volunteer who works with children and people, because the process, for the reasons I explained earlier, is probably a little bit more stringent, and it can be really, really scary if you don't understand the fact that this is the process that local authorities have to go through. And because of the fact that, as I said earlier, if you are a volunteer or a staff member or somebody who has access to groups of people because of your position, the local authority will work in a specific way. This will all be in your local authority's policies and procedures about allegations about staff members, and it usually involves it will always involve the LADO, which is the local authority designated officer, who has a responsibility when allegations are made against staff, volunteers and those that work with children and young people. So if the worst happens and there is an allegation made against somebody in your steering group and you followed your own procedures and policies and reported it on and it's being dealt with, what you also have to think about is for your forum, how you will work if either there's an allegation made in relation to them, or if a forum or steering group member comes to you and explains that there's perhaps a safeguarding issue that is happening to them and their child, where perhaps some allegations have been made by somewhere else and their child may be subject to a child protection plan, and they're involved with the local authority in that sense. You need to consider the impact on your forum and on your activities if you become aware of, or if a member of your forum discloses the fact that that's happening for them in their family. And that's not about isolating or ostracising individuals who may be experiencing challenging situations in their family lives, but it is about considering how effectively a member can participate in the way you want them to in the forum if they are experiencing what is often and likely to be a fraught and challenging situation in their engagement with the local authority. When there is a child protection process, it's a multi-agency process, so there will be engagement from health, education, social care, and obviously that makes it very difficult for everybody involved in that. If in one meeting you're there as an individual parent because of a safeguarding concern about your child, and then the next day you're in a participatory group meeting, so you just have to think about the impact that may have. And what we would generally suggest is it's useful to include some description about this in your code of conduct, or perhaps in your safeguarding policy and procedure, about what you would expect in this situation. And that may be that you would want that steering group member to temporarily stand down until the situation is resolved. Again, it's really helpful to have that in place and agreed before it happens, hopefully. And it's a no-blame situation. It's not about saying anybody who's done anything wrong or bad or anything of that nature, but it's purely about taking a neutral position that protects everybody and the forum. And it obviously doesn't preclude anybody from remaining a member of the forum, but you just may want to think about somebody's responsibilities during that period until those issues are resolved. Okay. So, I'm going to just talk a little bit about disclosure and barring. The disclosure and barring system is the government's process for providing information to employers and organisations about whether an individual is suitable for particular times of work. And they also keep the list of barred individuals who are forbidden from doing certain types of work with children and with adults. And there are 3 levels. There's a standard disclosure, an enhanced disclosure, and the barred list. And you may have been familiar with this in its previous form. The DBS process was supposed to have made things a bit easier in terms of checking individuals, but what it has done, it has put in place kind of this requirement that to have a DBS check, you have to be involved in regulated activity. And regulated activity includes regular work with children, which is unsupervised. So in most circumstances, people working with children need to be DBS checked unless they're being supervised by somebody else who's DBS checked, and some work with adults is also regulated. The reality for most forums is you probably aren't working unsupervised with children and young people, and that most of your contact, I would assume, with children and young people is where they are accompanied by their parents and carers. It's up to your forum really to assess whether the committee, parent reps, staff and volunteers are taking part in regulated activity. So you have to look at that definition that's above and consider whether what you do fits that criteria. And there aren't any hard and fast rules about that. It's up to you to decide on that as a committee and a group, and you should make a common sense decision. A DBS check obviously gives you some level of, it's a safeguarding measure because it helps you to see if somebody has any prior offences in terms of children and young people. However, there are lots of forums and lots of situations where you may not meet that regulated activity requirement. So the definition of supervision, in terms of you thinking about that, is regular and reasonable. So you are only legally obliged to apply if you are taking part in that regulated activity. And you can apply for the enhanced DBS check if you meet the regulated activity check and you're doing intensive, frequent and overnight work. You can't check, however, if a person's on a barred list if your role doesn't come under that. So there's lots more information about DBS checks and how you do that, because you would need to use an umbrella organisation to do that if you felt it was important to have a DBS check for your work and what you're doing. Again, we can have a whole separate webinar around DBS checks and what they mean and what they don't mean. This is just a really brief overview, and hopefully the links are useful to you there for you to find out a little bit more. So, we're coming to the end of our webinar now. Just some top tips for you as we finish. So, I appreciate there's been a huge amount of information in this presentation, and it's been a real whistle-stop tour looking at lots of complex issues which I've only really been able to very superficially talk about today. So try not to feel overwhelmed, even if this is just take it as a start, and you might want to think about it in a bit more detail with your other steering group members. Remember, whenever there's a decision that you need to make about safeguarding issues, you don't need to make it alone. So you can always contact your local authority child protection team for advice if you need it. It might be worth, as a forum, thinking about if you've got links to your local Safeguarding Children board. The LSCB and sometimes the adult safeguarding boards usually have a workforce development stream, and your forum might be able to access some training through them, and it may be free, it may not be free. You have to see what your local board is doing. It's a really good link to make though, and usually boards will have a voluntary sector rep on the board, so even if you can find out who that is and make links with them, it just means that you'll find out locally what's happening, and there might be some things that are relevant for you. So don't ever avoid situations because they make you feel uncomfortable. It's always better to take some action and to be wrong than to do nothing, because sometimes you might think the bit of information you've got isn't really important or relevant. But what we've seen in lots of these serious case reviews that have taken place over the last 20 years is that lots of people have different pieces of a jigsaw that make up the whole picture of what's happening to children and families. And on their own, they don't really mean anything, but when you put them all together, you see that bigger picture and things can be done. So sometimes you'll have your bit of the jigsaw, and it's really important to make sure that can help form part of that bigger picture. It's always really good to make sure you've got your policies and procedures in place before you need them, because it's much harder to write a retrospective policy and procedure if there's a situation where it involves somebody in your forum, or there's a situation that has involved your work as a part of the forum. It's very hard for policies and procedures that are written after or during that process for people not to feel it's very personalised towards them. If you can do it before a situation happens, it's much, much better, because then as you follow your policies and procedures, you can be clear that this is what was agreed. This is what you will apply to anybody, whoever, wherever it was. And don't forget that as forums, you can always speak to your advisor at Contact Family if you need some support or advice. We know that this can be a really hard part of what people do. We hope that for many of you that safeguarding isn't something you have to deal with a lot, but the reality is, particularly when you look at some of those statistics, around how many children and young people are abused every year is that purely by that statistical basis alone, it is likely that some of the families you're coming into contact with, children are in that position. So always pick up the phone, have a chat to your advisor if you need it. Okay, I'm trying to see if we've got a minute for any questions. I can see that somebody has asked about example policies. It would be good to have links to some that are considered to be good rather than not so good, so we will have a look at that. What we'll also do is we'll make sure that these slides are available for you online, and we'll look at any other questions that we've got or that come in the next few minutes and try and make sure there's a response to all of those, again with some links. Yes, you're absolutely right. I think it was Carol that's kind of sent that in. Yes, you don't want to trawl the internet and be looking at policies that perhaps are a bit out of date or not so good. So we'll try and make sure that there are some good examples online or on the website that you could have a look at. And obviously as forums, you know, it's quite a unique kind of role that forums have. So some of those kind of generic ones for groups, there are some bits that will be relevant, but perhaps some bits that aren't. Okay, we have now come to the end of our presentation. Well done if you managed to hang in there for all this time. Thank you so much for giving your time. We know that it's very valuable, and we really appreciate you taking the time to listen and share with us about this really important area of work. So thank you very much and goodbye.